Our next presenter, Laura McGuire. Laura, she there? She is? Okay, great. Laura comes to us today from Leavenworth, Washington, in the North Cascades, nestled here in the Pacific Northwest. Laura holds a master's degree in human factors and safety systems. She has 15 years experience working in industry in the aviation, forestry, and energy sectors. And Laura, with her PhD in cognitive systems, is well prepared to discuss how we use cognitive energy in our high-paced decision-making environments, and how those cognitive costs can escalate and cause us communication challenges. Incidentally, I have had the pleasure to work with Laura in the past, not at the university, mind you, but back here in 1998, Laura McGuire had an illustrious career as a liftie here at Fernie Alpine Resort. And she is one of the many staff that we have prepared and sent forth into the world to receive their doctorate. Laura's topic, controlling cognitive costs of coordination. She will delve into the topic of why communication becomes hard when we run out of cognitive capital. Take it away, Laura.
All right, thank you very much, Robin, and thanks so much for having me here today. Kudos to the organizing committee for just tucking and rolling with the events of this year. So I've only got 15 minutes to distill about 3 years of research, so I'm going to jump straight into it today. And the research that I'm sharing is looking at a very specific aspect of cognitive work. And when I'm talking about cognitive work, it's the thinking parts of your job. And the specific aspect of the cognitive work has to do with coordination across multiple roles and multiple points in time. And so the bottom line for my talk here today is to give you some new insights into practice with the intent of increasing the ability to increasing the capacity and the strategies that you have as part of a group or a team that's managing risk in avalanche terrain. So my intent here is to get you thinking when someone says it's a communication problem or we need to communicate more, to be thinking we need to coordinate more, or it may be a coordination problem. And so if that sounds a bit heady for a Monday morning, don't worry. I'm going to start us off with a really concrete example to get us all on the same page. And then in these 5 minutes up front, I'm going to lay out the central thesis of my talk, which is that we can level up the performance by thinking about the effort that's involved in this coordination more broadly, not just in communication. And then I'm going to take the next 5 minutes to talk about what happens with poor communication and how it actually incurs these additional costs, as Robin said, and it sucks up our valuable time and attention. And then lastly, I'm going to end with some strategies that you can use to control these costs of coordination across these multiple scales. So let's take a fictitious but probably a highly likely scenario for a control team that's responsible for managing risks to a transportation corridor, to a highway. And up here on Windrift Pass, the program manager is super diligent, and so a storm cycle that's coming in is going to wreak havoc upon the holiday travel. So coordination kicks into high gear. Right away, she calls her team. And she shares the plan. She finds out who's able to come in early, who can deal with this increased workload. She wants to make sure everyone's up to speed because it's likely that they're going to be triggering something big. So then she's calling in the big guns, and literally because the armed forces are going to need to be brought in to use the howitzer for this much snow. Then she's going to call local law enforcement to close those roads. Then she's got the plow trucks on standby because the last time this drainage released, it ran all the way across the road. And of course, that means that it's important that the local radio station is broadcasting the closures to control, the closures for the control work to avoid having vehicles piled up and waiting. And of course, the roadway signs need to change so that they can limit the amount of angry drivers that are sitting on the side of the road and unsure about what's going on. And lastly, they'll need to get the word out on social media so there isn't anyone out skiing lines on dawn patrol when they start blasting. So once this plan is in place, that's already a lot of coordination. And then there's ongoing continual adjustments and adaptations as the world throws surprises at us. And each time our manager here takes on additional effort to keep everyone appraised and to keep everyone adjusted relative to their own goals and priorities. So communication here is undoubtedly important, or in any other kind of similar situations where you have multiple roles that are related, but they all have separate goals and they have to work together to achieve a shared outcome. So today I want to broaden this lens from the communication of all of these roles to look at this underlying functional capability, and that's joint activity. And so you might be saying, yeah, we know this. This is why we have the procedures. And yeah, the procedures and the rules give us a shared frame of reference. But if we go throw back to 2018 ISSW, myself and my colleague, Jesse Percival, showed that of those 3 core findings, the most important one was that a lot of the cognitive work, a lot of the effort that goes into actually doing this work effectively is hidden. It's not in those formal protocols. And so today's work is going to go a little bit deeper on this finding by revealing that this additional cognitive effort is an additional burden, and it has to be accounted for in our work practices, it has to be trained for, and it has to be designed for in how we work together as a team. So the main thesis here is that accounting for both the cognitive and the coordinative demands of avalanche risk management work can improve this adaptability and the group performance. And this is particularly true as the pace and the complexity of work increases. So in the example that I gave you before, the tempo of work is quite low, there's lots of moving parts, but you might be able to anticipate and adjust in real time. In higher consequence events or higher pace events, your ability to adjust decreases, and you can get overwhelmed by these additional costs in the coordination. So you might say, well, is it actually worth coordinating then? And of course, it's pretty clear in avalanche management that you can't do that alone. And in fact, nearly all forms of meaningful or challenging work is joint activity. So not only is coordination important, it's unavoidably important. And work across the board is becoming increasingly interdependent. It's becoming more and more tightly coupled because the advantages afforded by technology. And so some of these technologies can change the nature of these coordinated parties as well. So you might be thinking, well, hey, I actually just installed a GAZX system, so we've effectively reduced the number of technicians. Have we decreased our coordination requirements? Not really. You've actually just transformed the nature of those coordination demands. Because instead of having boots on the ground, you've now extended that network to include all the technicians who service and maintain the systems, the software engineers who manage your interface with the system, and the parts manufacturers who you'll need when the parts break or when they wear out. So your coordination timescales expand, your parties change, and the nature of those relationships and dynamics change. So I'll be clear here to say that I'm not saying technology is a bad thing, but the point is that coordination across multiple parties is a given, whether it's someone on skis or whether it's someone on the other end of a support line. So if you're wondering why we're using the term joint activity and not teamwork, that is an excellent question, and I'm hoping that you ask it in the question and answer period. But we're going to move on because the second fundamental principle about coordination is that it incurs a cognitive cost for everybody involved. So these costs, they're not financial, they're cognitive. You spend precious resources attending to either organizing the coordinative activity, you're delegating it, you are maybe someone who is being directable, you're taking direction from someone else, you're communicating about shared plans, you're reprioritizing the goals, maybe you're taking initiative and you're trying to take on or take away some of the coordinated benefit or burden from someone else. Or you're investing in others. So you've recruited new resources to help lower some of the costs of coordination. But in order for them to be useful, you need to bring them up to speed to what's happening, what's the plan, and put them in place. All of that actually takes effort. And at a point in time where you may be least likely to be able to afford that effort. So this is a long walk to get to this argument that we should be emphasizing coordination over communication. And no one can disagree with the statement that good communication is important. In fact, it is critical to coordination. But when we unpack this further, we find it a little bit insufficient because knowing what to say, who to say it to, and at what point in time is all cognitive and coordinated work that's required for really smooth and successful coordination. So let's ground this a little bit because it is a pretty core concept. If you think about the last time that you came into a non-routine event in your work, it might be an expected part of the job, but something that represents an anomaly. It's kind of an outlier. It might have been a first aid emergency. It might have been a client that got caught and carried. Whatever it is, you come into the event while it's underway. And in order to have good communication in this context, there's a whole lot of background work that you need to do, additional cognitive work that has to happen very rapidly. Things like, okay, what does everyone else know about this situation? How current is that knowledge? How much do I have to share or do I need to be shared? And how much is too much? How much do other people know about what's going on? How good are they at what we are about to do? And what do they know about how good I am about what we're about to do? And then when we start thinking about who is involved, in what ways are they involved, who could be involved, you need people who aren't at the site right there. How do you get them involved? And what will they stop doing? What will they defer their work in order to come and help me? And lastly, at what point in time can we interrupt them right now? If not now, when can I get them? How do I adjust the things that I'm doing so I can slow down or speed up so we have good, smooth coordination across this shared activity that we're trying to do? So there's a lot that's going on in this slide, and it's the kind of slide that they tell you never to put into a presentation because it's busy and it's chaotic and it's kind of hard to understand. But I've also done that intentionally because it's representative of these coordinated demands that show up in day-to-day operations in the heat of the moment. And the more people that get involved, the faster the tempo, and the more geographically dispersed the parties are, and the higher the consequences of the outcomes, the more these demands can overwhelm the capabilities of a group for collective performance. We start to see things like coordination breakdowns, where the efforts required to sustain joint activity become very high. And you start hearing people talk explicitly about coordination. Wait, we need to stop, we need to regroup. You might start to see individuals break off instead of doing collective work. And this is where you see groups fail to accomplish their shared goals, or at its worst, where they can't sustain collective activity that keeps people safe. So there's a number of different concepts that I could talk about here, but I'm going to grab one because it's useful for us to think about, is common ground. And this is how we shared the shared knowledge, beliefs, assumptions about how work is being done, the organization that you're working in, and who you're working with. And we establish these when you take on a new job, a new organization, you move to a new area. You maintain it because the world changes, and so you have to continually adjust your knowledge and beliefs and assumptions. And lastly, it needs repairing, because when the pace of the world, the change in the world, exceeds the pace at which we can collaboratively update, we get left behind. So repairing looks like someone noticing that something's not right and asking questions. So common ground is both a joint activity. It's common to your organization, your role. Are you a guide? Are you a forecaster? Are you a technician? Your experience, are you the expert? Do you have local knowledge or expertise? It's relative to your organization. What kinds of goals and priorities does your organization expect out of your performance? And it's relative to the other parties in the group as well. What kinds of predispositions or orientations do they have to the work that you're about to do? And how do you interact with that? So we continually build and maintain this in our day-to-day interactions with coworkers that we work with continuously. But we also have to establish common ground about an incident. So if you're coming into a new event, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of ambiguity, and there may be new people or new parties that we don't know what they know, we don't know their level of experience or their orientation towards the problem. So when we coordinate with people that we share substantial common ground, we can handle a lot of variability in the types of incidents we respond to, because we're better able to recognize when we're deviating from our shared basis of knowledge or our beliefs or assumptions, and we may get in over our heads. So this is a super high blow-by of a pretty complex topic. But if I've done my job right, we should be on the same page that we'll get more mileage out of strategies for improving risk management through the broader lens of coordination. So I wanted to come back to something that I said earlier, and this is about the pace and complexity of work. Is the greater the trouble that you're facing, the higher the tempo that's demanded, the greater the information processing requirements are to cope with that trouble or activities. So these high tempo situations, if you haven't designed for coordination appropriately, you start paying the costs and the penalties of poorly supported work. So we covered a whole lot of terrain, and I promised these last couple minutes to be practical strategies, and I know I'm running long here. So I am a cognitive systems engineer. I think across the whole influence of the system of work, not just the avalanche professional, but the regulators who define some of the guardrails around their work, the industry associations that set the competency frameworks, the educators who define the education that they receive, and the management that in the organizations that they work in. So I'm going to start at the top, the industry association. Some of the strategies that we can use to better control coordination costs is to look at curriculum that can introduce coordination competencies. How do we help each other be better at coordinating and collaborating across a group? That's not just about communication. Can we encourage the adoption and practices of technologies that aid distributed information sharing and rapid exchanges of information? And how do we get industry-specific coordination devices? How do we elicit and interest tool manufacturers to be curious about the space that we work in? Operations managers, cataloging all of the coordination points in your operation is really time consuming, and it may not generate really reasonable return on investments. But it's worth asking your teams for examples of when they experienced coordination breakdowns, and to look at if you can shift the costs of coordination to other points in time or other roles. You can design for cross-functional interactions. If you are working across multiple roles that don't have good shared common ground, help them learn a little bit more about the goals and priorities of that role. And you can provide sufficient opportunities for realistic simulation training that includes both escalating coordinative and cognitive demands at the same time. And finally, for the individual practitioners and teams, these micro learning opportunities, when you see common ground breaking down, when you recognize that a colleague is making an incorrect assumption or you think it's an incorrect assumption, call it out. Use that as an opportunity to share knowledge, to bridge gaps in understanding, and to level up your team as a whole. Practicing coordination. Make yourself observable, prepare yourself for taking direction, learn a bit more about what others need from you in order to help coordinate more effectively with you. and get other roles involved in your decision making. So let me close by saying this. Cognitive costs of controlling the cognitive costs of coordination in avalanche terrain is not an easy problem, but it's an important one. And if we move past, if we move past the idea of communication, we open up a wider range of possibilities to be able to improve risk management. Thank you.
Wow, incredible. I can definitely relate to a number of those, what you're talking about, in a number of different scenarios, like an avalanche accident, or a lift goes down for an extended period of time, or opening a ski area during a pandemic. So thank you so much, Laura. That was a great discussion, very enlightening, and thank you so much from all of us in the ISSW committee here for presenting and being a part of this event. Now, we do have some time for some questions.
We have a question from the floor from Clancy Nelson, please. Go ahead, Clancy Nelson. Clancy, it
Having
looks like
coordination problems.
yeah, Clancy, it looks like your mic is on, but we're not getting any sound out of you. Give you one more try, please. Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. We have a question from Brad Acker, please.
Hello, yeah, thanks for the talk. This is Brad Acker. I'm down in the Pacific Northwest, US, so go OSU. When I think of coordination in our environment, I often think of the incident command system. Could you make some comments maybe about how the, is the incident command system a good example of this type of coordination leading to good communication?
Yeah, so the incident command system is an interesting one because I'd argue that it is an oversimplification. So in that model, for those of you who aren't familiar to it, in a very high level, the incident command is basically a structure that kind of creates a hierarchy of decision making and distributes kind of different roles and functions to different folks. But what happens in that kind of scenario is that having sort of a single, or in very large scale events, point of contact, that person can become a workload bottleneck because the pace of the event exceeds their ability to keep track of everything that's going on to the level that's needed to be making appropriate decisions and actions. So what we start to see is localized action taking place, people taking initiative, and this is often frowned upon in the ICS system because it is because the command and control sort of like hierarchy is expected there. So I think there is a balance. We don't want freeform anarchy where everybody just does everything, because that's uncoordinated activity, but we want localized initiative to be able to be taken so that those who are closest to a point in a point of the event, say if it's a rescue scenario, you can have smaller groups that break off and take initiative and handle smaller tasks and report that back. There is a number of other functions that are unsupported in the ICS system, in the sense of less, you take less advantage of the full capabilities of the team to be able to help coordinate. So by providing information, by proactively looking at certain things, by anticipating the needs of the incident commander, and preemptively kind of preparing for the next steps. So it can kind of slow down the activity in some ways. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
it's a bit of a controversial statement because it is very well accepted in a number of industries, but even the incident command, the disaster recovery community has actually started to question some aspects of that for their purposes as well. Okay, well, thanks for having me here.
Stand by. I think we have a email question.
Laura, this question is for you. It is from Clancy, who had technical issues before. He just posted his question on the chat box. When you talk about coordination as a cost that taxes our cognitive abilities, I picture an economic supply-demand chart. That kind of implies that coordination and cognitive abilities should be optimized, where a certain amount of coordination meets with the same amount of cognitive ability. Does that sound right?
It's an interesting concept. I think one of the things about coordination and cognitive demand is that people are very adept at deploying different strategies to control those costs. So they will shed load, they'll drop some tasks, they'll defer it to a different point in time, they'll pass it off to someone else. So in some ways, what they're doing is they're creating additional capacity for themselves, or they're using the capacity of others to be able to increase their own ability to maintain high levels of coordination and cognitive demands. So I think it's not necessarily a finite resource, if that's kind of where you're going with that question, but instead we can adapt and be quite resilient and in our capacity to be able to coordinate and deal with the technical aspects of the work that we're doing.
Okay, that pretty much concludes our time. Laura, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. Very interesting work, and you can see it have great value to me personally to sort some of these things out and become less cognitively overloaded at certain times. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.